So I'm just going to share my screen here with everybody. So hopefully you can all see that. So the resource is now available on the Public Record Office website. So I'm just taking you in from Google here. If you Google PRONI, you will get us at the first link, and that will bring you to the Public Record Office landing page. The resource is under our resources and learning section. So if you just expand that using the arrow, you'll be able to navigate down and see a link to a page giving you a little bit more information and background about the piece of work and linking you to the actual resource itself. So up here we have embedded in the text. You can just ping straight into the link, or it's located here within the main body text. So this will take you into the page where you can open the resource as a PDF. So this takes you into a PDF version of the resource, and you'll see we have some images displayed as part of the resource. Those are all referenced, and you'll find some information on the document. We have a short preface which brings you onto the contents page. So I should say the contents page is a navigable contents page. So as you'll see when I hover over all of these different elements, all of these are navigable links within the resource. So the resource is divided up. There's a substantial introduction, as has been mentioned, provided by Tim, and there are three sort of core parts within the resource. The first being the Third Home Rule crisis, covering the years 1910, predominantly 1910 to 1914, the First World War, covering the years 14 to 18, and then Partition and Revolution, covering the years 18 to 25, and that's further subdivided into themes. So as I said, there's a substantial introduction to the overall period, and then there are lengthy introductions to those three parts, and then there are shorter introductions to each of the sub themes. And as you'll see, each of the as Michael mentioned, there are 57 original transcriptions from original historical records, the majority of which are sourced from PRONI, and these are all categorized out by source, and each source has a contextual caption to give a little bit of information on what it is you're looking at and help you understand what it is you're looking at, and a transcribed element to that. And this brings us on in conclusion to let me see, to our sample questions and answers down at the bottom of the resource. There are two sample questions. Those are based on three sources from within the body of the resource, and there are also sample answers provided. So I'm just going to show you how this works. So for example, if we're looking at, let me see, we'll go down to the one near these. So for example, you can go down to this section where you will see a short introduction, a caption for the source, and a transcription of the source. And I've just picked that because it takes us nicely into our sample question and answers. So using the source below and your knowledge of the period, etc., etc., and then that takes us into suggestions for how you would go about answering that. If you want to navigate up to the contents page, the easiest way to do it within the PDF is to go back to page 4, and that will take you back up to the contents page. So you can navigate pretty easily within the resource and jump back and forward to the contents page as you wish, which seems like a fitting point at which, while I'm sitting in the introduction, to stop my screen share and pass across to Tim, who's going to talk about this in more detail. So over to you, Tim.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Janet. I do have a PowerPoint there somewhere, which I think Glenn will be able to put up, so you don't have to just look at me for the next half hour or so. I was thinking about what to say about how this all started, and I suppose we're thinking back very nostalgically to those days when we could get into PRONI, and I would sit having lunch with members of staff at PRONI when I was working on various books. Could we have the next slide, please, Glenn? You never give up an opportunity to advertise your wares. I always think I've been working away at PRONI for a number of years, and that's 3 of the books that have come out of that process. So the PhD book is Irish Regiments in the Great War, Discipline, Morale. Then it was followed by the Carson's Army book, Ulster Volunteer Force 1910 to 22, both still in print from Manchester University Press for a mere £17 in paperback, absolute bargain. And then the Disparity of Sacrifice about Irish recruitment in the First World War, which I co-authored with colleagues William Butler, Michael Wheatley. That's £85 in hardback, but of course the gift that keeps on giving. As I always tell my students, that's one way to look at it. So you'll get an idea from that my own expertise in this is very much in the sort of military, paramilitary side of things, and in the sort of third home rule crisis, First World War period. So I can't sit here and claim to be a great constitutional historian. And if you really want to read up on issues to do with partition, formation of the Northern Ireland state, there's a lot of very good books that I've put in the footnotes and discussed briefly. And also there's a book just out by Charles Townsend called Partition, which is about the partition of Ireland. So that would be another book that I'd very warmly recommend. Hopefully you can get these all from libraries NI. So while I was in PRONI and sort of working on these books and having lunch with friends and colleagues at PRONI, we did talk about this idea of the decade of centenaries that is now happening in Ireland North and South and what might be done. And we did think about how to revise the Steps to Partition guide that Michael was talking about. I'd forgotten just how old that was. It was a stalwart when I was doing my A-levels in 1991-92, but I'd forgotten that it was late 70s that it had first come out, and that was a very valuable resource. So we'd sort of thought that doing a reworked version of that could work quite well. The PRONI staff were quite keen for me to have a go at the introductory sections. I think partly this is because academic staff are sort of sitting about the day with nothing else to do, whereas PRONI staff are normally run ragged by their enthusiastic readers. I think the other bit was you might see that there are things that an academic can perhaps say that it's better a civil servant doesn't. So you can see what you make of that as you have a look at the pack. Now today, Stephen Scarth asked me particularly to have a look at issues within the pack to do with partition and the formation of the Northern Ireland state, because we're essentially in the centenary period of that. I'll talk a bit about the dates there and how they're a little awkward. The Northern Ireland Centenary Committee, of which I'm not a member, wasn't asked anything about it. They came to the conclusion the 3rd of May was the sort of the centenary birthday of the Northern Ireland state, to do with when the Government of Ireland Act comes into effect. If I'd been asked, I would have gone for the 22nd of June, which is when King George V opens the Northern Ireland Parliament. But you could pick all sorts of other dates. It's into 1922 before devolved powers are really given over to the different departments in Northern Ireland. And as you see in the final things I'll talk about today, it's 1925 until the Boundary Commission report is released, and the decision is to keep the Northern Ireland border as it had been established in 1920 and as it is today in the 6 counties. So that's some of the thoughts about how we approach these things. I think the other bit I should say, and I'm conscious that I have a mixed audience today. I saw some people's images there which suggest that we've got a mix of people. I don't know if we've got anybody that's actually doing their A-levels at the minute. Several that I suspect have done this in the past. And there's always an issue there about where primary materials fit in to a study of the past. One of the key things I'll be pulling out today, and which Jim will be pulling out today, is some of the myth making that surrounds some of the documents in the pack. There are some of these that are not really very well understood. They're often referenced in sort of popular works or in common discourse, something like the Ulster Covenant, for example. But very few people actually sort of know them in detail and have access to full transcriptions of them. So there is these sort of myths that have emerged around some of them. There's also what the role of primary sources are for the historian, and this is again quite a tricky one. About 15 years ago, when I was last marking A-level papers, I think I was frankly amused at the answers that I got from a number of candidates, where I was basically told that any secondary work, so any book written by a historian like me, was essentially worthless because the historian hadn't been there and hadn't witnessed what went on. But then anybody who was there and had witnessed what went on, nothing that they had written could be believed because that was all biased. So, amongst all that, I wasn't quite sure where that left the historical profession. That's perhaps the ultimate sort of postmodernist view, that no sources are reliable and every source is only as reliable as any other source. But that I think is to take things to the extreme. But I think that the primary documents often allow you to work out a bit about the debates between historians and to try and form your own opinion amongst those. And as I say, some of these sort of myths and sort of generalizations that are made about documents can be exposed by going through the text in some detail. I think there's two wider contexts I should say a little bit about today. I'll try and keep this brief. The pack really starts in 1910. We start an introductory piece from 1900 to 1910. But there is, of course, a longer story about Irish Home Rule, which takes us back certainly until 1870 with the formation of the Home Rule Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party. That by 1885 is the dominant political force in Ireland. And then, of course, we have two Home Rule bills that are introduced to the House of Commons. There is one in 1885 and there is one in 1890. 92, 93. These are both defeated. The first Home Rule Bill is defeated in June 1885 by a majority of 30 in the House of Commons. The second Home Rule Bill is defeated by a majority of 34 in September 1893 in the House of Lords. So there is a sort of constitutional blockage there, which isn't resolved until 1910 when you get the People's Budget and then the Parliament Act of 1911. It's possible for the House of Commons to overrule the House of Lords. Up to that point, that was impossible. So there is a point where, however keen the Liberals are to bring through Home Rule, they're conscious that this can't go anywhere against what is then a Tory-dominated House of Lords. So that accounts for the sort of time gaps between these things. And people often wonder, why are you talking about a third Home Rule crisis in 1910? What were the other Home Rule periods? So that's what you're looking at there. Now, what should be said in these two earlier Home Rule bills is that there was no mention of partition in either of those. The idea was that simply Ireland as an island would become a political unit, and we'd have a devolved government sitting in Dublin, and that would still be within the United Kingdom. So that's very much a devolved model of the sort that we'd recognise today for Scotland and Wales. Certainly that sort of idea. But what you have then, when these Home Rule bills fail, you have Ireland governed as a political unit in a fairly complicated manner. Historians are sort of divided about the aspects of this. In one aspect, Ireland is being governed as an integral part of the United Kingdom. It's sending about 100 MPs to Westminster. It's got, after 1898, local government that's very much on the then British model, county councils, and so on, with the same sort of franchise. And so that looks fairly familiar to what's happening elsewhere in the UK. But you then have a strange sort of colonial element to this. You do have a Lord Lieutenant in Ireland who is sort of a colonial governor, and who wears a feathery hat and holds levees and opens various events as seen on various occasions. So that gives it a strange sort of imperial feel rather than a sort of British governed and integral part of the UK feel. So that is quite awkward. And then there is a Chief Secretary for Ireland, which is effectively like a Secretary of State for Ireland, which you don't have in Scotland until 1926, and you don't have in Wales until 1964. So this idea of having Ireland with its own sort of chief minister looks a little odd compared to what's going on in the rest of the UK as well. So there are those sort of tensions between a colonial model and a British model that you see in Ireland in the early 20th century. So that's some sort of context about how Ireland's governed and the earlier Home Rule movement. If I could turn to my next slide, please, Glenn. We've got a map of Europe there just after the Versailles Peace Conference. And this is something else to say by way of context, that redrawing the map of the British Isles in 1920, 1921 is something that seems to fit in very much with the mood of the time in Europe. With the end of the First World War, you've had the collapse of the Russian, Austro-Hungarian and German empires. You've also had the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, and that has led to a massive redrawal of boundaries. So, for example, France takes the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine, which it had lost in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. It takes those back from Germany in 1919, 1920. Then you have the creation of entirely new states, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, perhaps the best known, which Yugoslavia is effectively a sort of greater Serbia, Serbia having been an allied power in the Great War. Czechoslovakia put together from some of the ethnic groups within the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. You also get an independent Poland that's carved out from parts of the Austro-Hungarian, parts of the German, and parts of the Russian Empire. So there's a lot of sort of state building going on in Europe at that time, and we might think of the case of Ireland and Northern Ireland within that. With what happens in Europe, it's worth saying that some of the ideas there are a little more imaginative than what is seen in Ireland. You have, for example, a plebiscite overseen by the League of Nations in Silesia, which allows people there to vote on whether they should go into, whether they should stay under German control or whether they go under control of the new independent Poland. So that was one way of resolving a boundary dispute, which was to have effectively a referenda by local areas. And there's something of an irony in that a lot of the British troops that are out there overseeing that referenda are from the Irish regiments. So that gives a particularly local flavour to it. If I turn then to the origins of partition, I'll say a little bit here about the Third Home Rule crisis. And I think the key document here is hopefully my next one here, Glenn, if I can have that, please. Sorry, Carson, the Irish Unionist leader, who one of the great myths is that he is one of the or that he is the sort of founding father of the Northern Ireland state. If I can have the next slide, please, Glenn. Very famous statue of Carson outside Parliament buildings, but as you'll see from some of the comments that I've got in the pack and elsewhere, Carson is not terribly keen on the creation of a Northern Ireland state. A lot of what Unionists are doing in the period between 1911 and 1914 is using the Ulster case, which they think is the strongest Unionist case, to try and get public support in Britain to try and quash Home Rule for Ireland as a whole. So Carson is not in 1911 madly keen about establishing a partitioned state, and certainly not on Northern Ireland Parliament. So the statue makes you think that this is the father of the Northern Ireland Parliament. That's not the way Carson wanted to be identified himself. The way is bizarrely present when this statue is unveiled. It's a very unusual statue that's put up in his lifetime, about a year before he dies. It's unveiled. There's a fundamental split within unionism, north and south, which becomes very evident as you get to certainly 1920, arguably 1916. Some have traced that back to 1905 with the formation of the Ulster Unionist Council. So there is an issue about where you think of Ulster Unionism as compared to Irish Unionism, and that's something worth referencing there. If we could take the next slide, please. The Ulster Covenant is one of the most important documents of the Third Home Rule crisis, and that's reproduced in the pack. This gives you an idea of the crowds that are outside Belfast City Hall on Covenant Day, 28th September 1912. It's thought that this might be one of the largest crowds ever seen in Irish history. Daniel O'Connell possibly got more at Tara Hill for one of his repeal meetings. Population of Ireland, of course, was much larger at that time than it was in 1912. But it's thought that the crowd you have here is at least 250,000 strong and throngs all the way down Royal Avenue, for those of you that know Belfast. If I could have the next slide, please, Glenn. So this then is the covenant itself. And this is one of the myths that I said I'd refer to. There is an idea that the Solemn League and Covenant is basically a text calling for partition and calling for the formation of a Northern Ireland Parliament. And parts of it certainly don't read that way. So we have you being convinced in our consciences that Home Rule would be disastrous to the material well-being of Ulster as well as the whole of Ireland. So there's an idea that this is still an issue. It's about Ireland. It's not just about Ulster. And then there's talk about that they want to defeat the present conspiracy to set up a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland. So it's to prevent a Home Rule Parliament being set up rather than to get another Home Rule Parliament set up in Belfast. So that's an important context in which to see that. And many Ulsterians at that time will very happily identify themselves as Irish on the 1911 census forms, for example. And Carson will talk about himself as Irish. So it's not that you've got a very different sort of Ulster identity at this point, and that this is a clarion call for an independent Ulster, or an Ulster governed very differently to the rest of Ireland. The Women's Declaration, which is issued in support of that text, and actually gets more signatories than the Covenant. There, women sign a document that talks about them as women of Ulster and loyal subjects of our gracious king, being firmly persuaded that Home Rule would be disastrous to our country. Country being Ireland, not province as in Ulster. So that gives you some idea about the way in which these local issues, provincial issues are being teased out within a wider Irish, British, and indeed British imperial identity. The Covenant itself is, of course, signed on a 9-county basis. So it's the historic province of Ulster, modern-day Northern Ireland, plus Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan. That creates some problems later on, as you'll see from Charles Curtis Craig's comments in the House of Commons, which I think Jim's going to take you to later. And actually, the sort of firm ideas about partition in many ways come from the Liberals. It's a Liberal backbencher, Tom Agar Roberts, who first talks about the idea of 4-county partition, that in June 1912, so he's saying the 4 majority Protestant counties should be allowed to opt out of Home Rule. You then get 2 future prime ministers, Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George, then senior cabinet ministers, in March 1914. They're talking about an idea of a county option, that there should be these county plebiscites or mini referenda that would allow different counties within Ulster to decide whether they would remain under Westminster control or under the Dublin Home Rule Parliament. That with a time cap of 6 years, that at the end of 6 years that process would happen again. Edward Carson talks about 9-county partition in January 1913, but the thought is that that's an attempt to try and wreck Home Rule for the whole of Ireland, because at that time Belfast was the largest city in Ireland, and the finances of Home Rule simply didn't add up back then if you excluded Ulster. So that's one of the things that Carson's pushing. I think to see Carson as somebody who's very keen on partition is to be very misled. Carson is, of course, a Dubliner, and when the option comes to him later in life, 1921, to lead the new Northern Ireland government, he declines that and pursues a legal career in England, and indeed he ends up as a senior law lord sitting in the House of Lords. So a Dubliner who's never quite happy with the Northern Ireland state, and is very dismissive in later life of how he felt he had been used by the Conservative Party. Indeed, Alvin Jackson's book on Home Rule and Irish Story has an excerpt from Carson quite late in life, where he's supposed to have said to some dinner guests that on reflection, really it would have been better all round if we had went along with Mr. Gladstone's ideas of Home Rule in 1886. So Carson is leading Ulster Unionism, but is not quite part of Ulster Unionism, and certainly becomes rather disillusioned with it as you get to 1920. If I could have the next slide, please, Glenn. Oh, no, our slides have packed up. Right, we will press on without them. What we get with the third Home Rule crisis then is that effectively is sort of put on ice because of the outbreak of the First World War. So there's no real resolution at that stage about what should happen in terms of partition or Home Rule. The deal that's made in September 1914 is that Home Rule will be placed in the statute book, but then at the end of the war, things will be done to make special provision for Ulster. Now, during the war itself, the arguments for changes. For the Irish Parliamentary Party, a lot of members in that, particularly Willie Redmond, who's the brother of the party leader John Redmond, think that if Irish nationalists and unionists are serving together in the British Army, particularly in the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster divisions, then they will have a sort of comradeship of the trenches, and at the end of the war will be able to sort of reconcile their differences and will be able to live in a Home Rule Parliament together. So that's the sort of Irish Parliamentary Party take, which of course is then repeated later on with some of the sort of community relations type things that people have been asked to teach in schools at Key Stage 3, which is sort of this idea of sort of reconciliation caused by the First World War, which is a little tricky. To put it mildly, the nationalist opinion is moving, unionist opinion is moving, and the idea that this could be a great sort of, love-in and hands across the barricades in the Western Front is really slightly difficult, to put it mildly. What I've put up there is the Ulster Tower at Thiepval, which I'm sure many of my audience have visited. This, of course, can be seen as part of a sort of foundation myth of the Northern Ireland state, and it's the first British memorial to be put up on the Somme, and it's unveiled in November 1921. So built and funded by the Northern Ireland government, and very much making a statement about Ulster's role in the First World War and the idea that the British government had a debt of honour to the new Northern Ireland state because of the sacrifice of the Ulster Division on the 1st of July 1916. Nationalism, of course, moves on. John Redmond's call for Irishmen to enlist, Irish nationalists to enlist in the British Army in large numbers is not received with massive enthusiasm. And of course, things move on then very much with the Easter Rising. So both communities, Irish Republicans, Ulster Unionists, can look to a blood sacrifice in 1916, the Easter Rising for Republicans, the Somme for Unionists. So that in some ways changes the debate. After the Easter Rising, then you've got proposals put forward by David Lloyd George, which are to bring in some form of home rule and to try to, I suppose, bring something to the middle ground in Irish politics and to try and get some sort of agreement around that. The problem is that Lloyd George tries to play off both sides. He tells Edward Carson that there will be 6-county partition and that will be permanent. He tells John Redmond, the nationalist leader, that there will be 6-county partition, but that will only be a temporary measure until the end of the war. It becomes clear through the press that the men have been told different things and this really goes nowhere. What's important in it in political terms is that the Ulster Unionist Council agrees to go with 6-county partition at this stage rather than 9, which is what the UVF and all that had been talking about in 1914. And there's also a nationalist convention that meets in Belfast that goes along with the idea of 6-county partition, though only after there have been attempts to silence delegates from the west of the province. You then get the Irish Convention, where we have a couple of sources about that in the pack. And that is meant to be an attempt to bring in some sort of home rule in 1917, 1918, but doesn't really lead to any new debate or discussion from the point of view of Ulster Unionists, because their delegation is told to go there and insist on 6-county partition as permanent partition, and that's it. So they've effectively no room to negotiate, so that doesn't really bring us anywhere much. Now, if we're thinking about partition being established in 1920 and 1922, there are a number of contexts we can think of there. Sinn Féin wins a landslide in the 1918 general election, so the old Irish Parliamentary Party is effectively swept away in that election, so the debate changes there. We have depending on your politics, what's called either the Anglo-Irish War or the Irish War of Independence, fought out between 1919 and 21. So there's now militant action taking place. There is an insurgency and counterinsurgency going on. There's then the idea of the unfinished business of 1914. Home rule had sort of been put on ice by the legislation then and couldn't just be sort of forgotten and ignored as you got into 1919 and 1920. And there's also the desire of the British government to try and solve the Ulster question, which they think they can resolve relatively straightforwardly. It shows you how misguided governments can be, and then they can move on to try and diffuse the bigger Irish question. So that's the sort of context in which you can see the establishment of the Northern Ireland state. And there's then a number of different dates you can go to for the foundation of the Northern Ireland state, all of them rather problematic, I think. There's the 23rd of December 1920, when the Government of Ireland Act is passed in Westminster, which tries to set up two Home Rule parliaments, one sitting in Belfast governing the 6 counties, the other in Dublin governing the 26 counties. In the south, Sinn Féin again sweeps the board, refuses to have anything to do with this, what would have been a devolved parliament within the UK. So that becomes a dead letter in the south. But in Northern Ireland, the 1920 legislation, Government of Ireland Act, effectively becomes the constitution of Northern Ireland up until 1972, when the Stormont Parliament is dissolved. You can then look at the date that the Centenary Committee came up with, the 3rd of May 1921, which is when the Act comes into force, though you wouldn't have actually seen anything happening on the ground on that day. You then have the election in 24th of May 1921, a general election held, which returns 40 Unionists, 6 Nationalists and 6 Sinn Féin MPs to the Northern Ireland Parliament. You could then have the 7th of June 1921, when there's a preliminary meeting of the Northern Ireland House of Commons, when the Cabinet is appointed, when James Craig is selected as Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Or you could have the 22nd of June 1921, when King George V opens the Northern Ireland Parliament. So these are the sort of dates you could play about with there. Or indeed as late as 1925 with the Boundary Commission, which then settles the border. Now, what I should say is that the arrangements that come in 1921 are sometimes seen as a sort of unionist solution to the Ulster question. There's certainly an element of truth to that. Walter Long, who's the cabinet minister responsible for a lot of this, is a former leader of the Irish Unionists. The Sinn Féin MPs elected in 1918, of course, are abstentionist MPs and refuse to take their seats in the House of Commons. So there's no sort of effective opposition to what's being put through in Parliament itself. But we shouldn't go perhaps too far with this. A number of unionists feel betrayed, and this comes up particularly in the source from Charles Curtis Craig that Jim's going to talk about in more detail. You have problems there where the Covenant has been reneged on. It's signed for the 9 counties of Ulster. 3 are then being ignored as their signatory states. So that's an issue that comes up there. Edward Carson, as I said, isn't keen to be a Prime Minister of a Northern Ireland state and decides to go back into the legal profession. So that shows you a sort of dissent from Southern Unionists who feel that they as a group are being sold out. And indeed, Carson spends a lot of his later life trying to get compensation payments for Southern Unionists who have had property destroyed or goods destroyed during the revolutionary period. Craig's stuff then looks at this in detail. I'll leave that to Jim. If I could have the next slide, please, Glenn. I'm almost there, don't worry. This then is the programme from the opening of the Parliament of Northern Ireland by George V on 22nd of June 1921. What is set up then is something that is very, very much in the Westminster model. So you get a House of Commons and a Senate, replicating the Commons and the Lords. The Senate in Northern Ireland is simply elected by the House of Commons. So there's no sort of interesting ideas there about how you would give representation to minority groups in a Senate, which you do get in the Irish Free State Constitution. You then have a government that's set up which looks a little imaginative at times. You have a Ministry of Labour, for example, and some think that that's an attempt by the Ulster Unionist Party to sort of win over Labour support in Belfast. But of course, this being Northern Ireland, the Minister of Labour is J.M. Andrews, who is a major industrialist based in Cumber and County Down, who owns the linen mill and owns a distillery there. So this is not a sort of Labour ministry as in a trade union facing ministry. So there are things done that on the face of it look as if they're progressive and different, but in reality don't look that radical at all. The message that's given by the King, again, I think this is something that Jim wants to go into in more detail, but the King's speech is often talked about as a very conciliatory speech and one that is meant to diffuse a lot of the tensions in Ireland and allow for a proper discussion between the British government and Sinn Féin representatives. It's well welcomed by the British press and certainly sections of the Irish press, but we shouldn't get too carried away with that as being a wonderfully hands across the barricade speech that wins over all shades of opinion. If I could have the next slide, please, Glenn. Yeah. This is the opening of Parliament, so you'll get an idea. It's at Belfast City Hall at that stage. You should say it's into the 1930s before Stormont is completed, so you'll get an idea of the crowds that turned out to witness George V. And if you could have the next slide, please. And this then is the wreckage of the train that was bringing the cavalry escort that had accompanied George V at Belfast City Hall back to the Curragh camp in Dublin. The train is blown up in County Armagh, and you'll get an idea about the destruction of the train from the photograph. There are 4 troopers killed and 20 injured there from the 10th Hussars, and you'll also see some of the dead horses there in the picture. So this is the IRA's original riposte to George V's speech, that this isn't sort of the end of the war, and some have said this shows the sort of limits of British military policy in Ireland by that stage of the Anglo-Irish War. Another issue that we look at more in the pack, if I could have the next slide, Glenn, please. Yeah, I'll come to that in a minute. One that I'll sort of leave you with is the Boundary Commission. But just before I come to that, the control of policing by the Unionist government is something that was very controversial at the time and still is in the historiography. We've included some of the sources on the Cushion Doll incident, and that shows members of the Ulster Special Constabulary, who it's shown by a British inquiry, are effectively operating outside the law. And Christopher McGill, in his recent book looking at this, and he's used the Ulster Special Constabulary archive at PRONI, which has recently been opened. He says that it seems most likely that the A specials of the Ulster Special Constabulary carried out a triple punishment killing in Cushion Doll. That's his reading of the evidence, which you'll see is conflicted. There's a British government inquiry, there's a Northern Ireland government inquiry that come up with rather different views. The wider historiography of the Ulster Special Constabulary, which I talk about in the introductory pieces, is very widely divided. You've got effectively an official history by Arthur Hazlitt, and you've got a more sort of left-wing Republican take on it by Michael Farrell. So there's a great sort of divide between those two, and careful work in the archive at PRONI should throw a lot more light on that. I'll end up then with a few pieces on the Boundary Commission. I just leave that to show you where the Boundary Commission was actually going. The Boundary Commission is established by the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 and sets up a 3-member commission that's to review the border and come up with ideas about what might happen. Now, Lloyd George, when he's dealing with Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith in December 1921, seems to have suggested that really large chunks of Northern Ireland would be hived off for the Irish Free State, that the whole of South Armagh, the whole of Fermanagh, whole of Tyrone, Derry City would all go, and then that what was left would be a sort of Greater Belfast and nothing much else, which would then want to vote to go in with the Irish Free State. That seems to have been the way that Lloyd George sold this to the Sinn Féin delegation. But you'll see that the report that comes out in 25 actually suggests very, very minor adjustments. You would get chunks of South Armagh that would go in with the Irish Free State, parts of Fermanagh that might have gone in with the Irish Free State, but also a part of East Donegal that would have come into Northern Ireland with the redrawal of the boundary. Now, this is a very messy process, the Boundary Commission. Essentially, the report is leaked and is published by the Morning Post newspaper, a conservative newspaper in London. And there's then a tripartite agreement between the British, Irish, and Northern Ireland governments to simply leave the border where it is. And that, of course, is where it still is today. These sort of ideas of redrawing the border have come up at various times, 1970s, 1980s, and so on, and the same sort of idea, but obviously nothing has come off them. I'm conscious I've probably exceeded my time, so I'll shut up at this point and hand over to Jim, who will talk you through a couple of the sources and how they might be approached for an A-level question. Thanks.
Okay, Tim, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, that's good. Right. It's a very simple thing. This came about over a long conversation with Tim and myself and others in PRONI last 2 years or so, when we were allowed the building. And the education pack, Steps to Partition, dates back to 1976. And I remember in the early 1980s, the two cheapest things you could buy in the university bookshop were Steps to Partition and the Communist Manifesto. So I've written a textbook since then on Russian history for schools, and now I'm doing some on partition, so I've now achieved both aims. Now, all sources are useful in history. There's 57 documents there in the pack. It's taken a lot of work to maintain to us, especially thanks to Ian Montgomery too in particular, and Stephen, amongst others. We talk about there's a schools essay competition. The deadline's is still on the next week. So any teacher, get your student in, there's cash prizes, any parents, grandparents, likewise, check the HTANI website for details. And what I did for today is, like, one thing when as a teacher, you try to teach the young people that all sources are useful in history, okay? Every bit of information is useful, and they aren't the dreaded word biased because they come from one side, not the other. And we have selected sources that cover both nationalist and unionist opinions about what was happening at that contentious period in our history, in our shared history. And what I did for today was I just decided to pick two sources in particular to look at and take you through their importance from an educational point of view. And the first thing I was going to look at was source 41. And source 41 is from March the 20th, it's in page 87, and I went on, it comes from March 1920. And it's a very important source because it's by Captain Charles Craig. And when students are looking at these sources, they're expected to put them inside their historical context. So first of all, one of the things I was a teacher I taught them was the date. Why is it important? Well, it's March 29th, 1920. Home rule had been put on the shelf because of World War I. And after the war, it was agreed to go back and revisit home rule under the coalition government led by Lloyd George. Okay, Lloyd George bears large similarities with Boris Johnson, charismatic politicians who do their own things. Okay, home rule wasn't discussed until October 1919 because, as Tim said, the map of Europe has been redrawn, the Treaty of Versailles. And by February 1920, proposals have been drafted about home rule, which the unionists weren't happy about. Okay, the Ulster Unionist Council had agreed a position on what was called the Better Government of Ireland Bill at that time by the 7th of March 1920. Home rule was debated for the first time since World War I in Parliament, and a 3-day debate, and the first day of the debate was March 29th, 1920. So date's important. Charles Craig is telling the House of Commons the unionist position. Okay, Charles Craig, of course, was a brother of James Craig. So one of the nuances would be that Charles Craig could maybe say things that his brother couldn't say as the leader of Ulster Unionism. And Craig himself doesn't become leader of Unionism himself until February 1921. He's telling the House of Commons what their bottom line is, okay, what the position is. It's the opening speech in the debate. So it's a really important speech. It's a public speech. So the MPs would have heard the speech, or people in the audience, in the gallery would have heard it. But more importantly, it would be in the press. And in those days, everybody read a proper newspaper. In our local newspapers in Northern Ireland, we contained national news first and local news second. So he's got a clear, so the date's important, the offers, and so is the motive. Okay, Charles Craig has a clear agenda here. What he is trying to do is trying to set the unionist position, persuade the MPs that Ulster deserves special treatment, Ulster deserves exclusion. And he sets out the criteria for it. We asked the young people to look at the audience. The audience are the MPs directly and indirectly, the public opinion in Britain and GB, who are reading the debate in the newspaper the next day. Tone, talk about language use, he's very persuasive. And also when students in schools are told to engage with the content of the source, to engage with the question. So Charles Craig chats about, the bill, he talks about we have made our province prosperous under the Union. So the Unionists believed that the North was different because it was prosperous, it was industrialized because of the Act of Union. He talks about somebody called Mr. T.P. O'Connor. T.P. O'Connor is a fascinating character. He is an Irish parliamentary IPP MP. He's a nationalist MP. But he represented an English constituency, and he'd be the last member of the IPP in the House of Commons. Liverpool Riverside, if you want to know. At that time, as Tim's mentioned earlier, Sinn Féin had swept the boards, and we were 7 IPP MPs in Parliament. They were a forgotten voice. He talks about the 6 counties. He talks about the basis of the exclusion settlement. 6 counties would become, and he makes it quite clear, it's in terms of numbers and security of a 6-county settlement. He talks about the 3 counties of Donegal, Cavan, and Monaghan that would be lost. More importantly, as Tim sets out, and he showed it earlier with the Ulster Covenant, Charles Craig refers back to the Ulster Covenant and its importance as part of the historical settlement, and how unionists had threatened to resist the Covenant by all means necessary. So it's a very, very important source. Charles Craig says it quite clearly what the unionist case is going to be. So the importance to the historian is in its timing. Home rule's on the agenda. New nations are being created across Europe. The World War I has had a dreadful impact upon Ireland, and Ireland's become, in fact, a very divided nation because of World War I and how the nationalists and unionists have reacted to it. And he's trying to persuade public opinion and the government that the unionists deserve some sort of special consideration. And it's real important is that maybe he is saying things his brother could not say. And if you look through, the whole speech is very important. And the conclusion really justifies that, in his opinion, the unionists deserve some special consideration. Now, at that time, the War of Independence, the Long-Irish War, was starting to get really underway in what became the Irish Free State. The whole position is that Parliament is changing too. It's a coalition government. How much longer can a federal government remain in power? How can the union secure a federal assembly? And what Charles Craig sets out refers back to where they've been in terms of home rule in 1912, and also, more importantly, what their aim would be. And their aim was to create a 6-county state, a 6-county devolved administration, the very thing they had fought against in 1912 to 14. So a student going through that source will be expected to analyse the source carefully, extract relevant information, present some relevant contextual information as I've illustrated, and then come to the conclusion why this source would be important. Why you don't just dismiss it because it's biased, because it comes from James Craig's brother. It's very, very important because it says it clearly to the Parliament, to government, what the unionists wanted to achieve, which is some form of partition or some form of exclusion for their security and for their long-term future, economically and politically. The next source I want to look at is source 45. And source 45 is clearly linked to source 41. It's 15 months later. The goalposts have been moved. And what we now have is the creation of the Northern Ireland Parliament and State, as Charles Craig had outlined in the speech of March 29th, 1920. It's the King's message. Very important. The King of the monarchy is seen to be above politics. The King is here to deliver an important speech. Parliament, the date is important, June the 22nd, 1921, because just 2 weeks earlier, the Northern Ireland Parliament had met for the very first time and appointed as cabinet and government just 2 weeks earlier. Charles Craig's brother, James Craig, was now appointed as the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, a job which Carson had declined, quite wisely in my point of view. So the date's important because it's setting up the Northern Ireland State, it's putting the Northern Ireland State into practice, not just theory. And the author's important. It's the King setting out on behalf, as the head of state and the head of government, what the government wants to achieve by the Government of Ireland Act. The mode is a public speech. It's a public speech addressed to the MPs and members of the government who are present. And not just that, the various dignitaries who have been invited to this speech. Also, the speech will be printed in local newspapers, setting out the government's point, what the King was going to say. And you argue that the motive is that the King is trying to persuade people, that this is the best deal possible. As Tim alluded to earlier, is speech more addressed to UK public opinion, okay, to British public opinion, who is worried about what becomes a very bitter conflict in Southern Ireland, is it more addressed towards London, shall we say, rather than Belfast and Dublin. But the King does set out quite clearly support for the government and a support for key decisions made over Home Rule, which has been a contentious issue since 1885, and more importantly, 1912 to 14. So the audience are the people invited. The tone the King used very measured and selective language to stress his point of view. You argue he's persuasive. And he says like, for all who love Ireland, I do with all my heart. He says he loves Ireland. Okay, many people, such as King Edward II and Queen Victoria, have been regular visitors to Ireland, and they stress they love Ireland in the same context they love Scotland. He talks about the history of the 6 counties. So yet again, he alludes to the eventual settlement. So it's a very important speech. The King sets out that it's basically, some people today, as Tim alluded to, will say it's like an olive branch or a message of peace, okay? And what he aspires, he talks about North and South, okay? Because elections have been held to the Parliaments North and South in May the 24th, a month earlier, which of course had been rejected by nationalists, by Dublin, by the Southern Parliament, and the Northern Parliament elected became the first Northern Ireland Parliament. It's held in the Belfast City Hall. So this has turned into a massive state occasion. As we are aware from recent evidence, such as the documentary 2 weeks ago, members of the British government are very concerned that the King was coming to Belfast and this could make him prone for an IRA attack. Indeed, we've seen ourselves the IRA threat was real, because just 2 days later, as the photograph I sent Tim used there, showed you how the Royal Cavalry were attacked and ambushed by the IRA as they passed through South Armagh. As I say, there's nothing new in Irish history. So the King talks about full partnership in the United Kingdom. The King talks about religious freedom, things that he mentioned actually in the Covenant. So the King's speech to me is very, very important. It's just about the setting up of a separate settlement, the Northern Ireland State, a separate creation. Its message is aimed at not just public opinion in Britain, but persuading the Unionists that they accept this is the best deal possible. He's offering, you can say, an olive branch to Irish nationalism. More importantly, the King goes back to the word empire. The word empire features in the Covenant. It features in most Unionist speeches, because he wanted Ireland to remain as part of an empire, even if what became the Irish Free State rejects, a British imposed settlement and creates their own. It's significant that this time the king would be aware that truce talks were being held in secret, and then a truce emerged in the Anglo-Irish War, War of Independence, only a few weeks later on July the 11th, 1921. So in terms of context, the student would be know that whole is a state of flux in Irish politics this time. And the speech is very, very important because you argue that it sends a secret message out to people in Dublin, like De Valera and Collins, etc., that they're willing to, that Britain is actually willing to make peace with a group of Lloyd George are called murderers only 1 year earlier. So it's a very, very important speech. Okay, but these are only two sources. We can only be very selective here for our discussion today. There are 57 sources, but history is always about learning something new. Only last week, I worked on an article about the impact of partition upon railways in the northwest of Ireland. I discovered that the Londonderry Lockswilly Railway Company, 100 miles of railway, only 4 miles in Northern Ireland, constructed their first customs post in April 1923 for the Irish Free State at the request, by the way, of the Irish Free State, by the way, who were still fighting the Civil War. But they were built their customs posts out of wood because they foreseen that they were only going to be temporary customs posts because the Boundary Commission had yet to report. And the Boundary Commission suggested that parts of Donegal near Derry or Londonderry could become parts of Northern Ireland. So I thought it's significant that even in April 23, that you build your new customs posts out of wood because they're foreseen as a temporary measure, not a permanent measure that they became on right through until the 1980s or 1990s. So we hope really, as on behalf of the History Teachers Association of Northern Ireland, this website, this resource will be available on our website as our details of the essay competition. We hope that the small sample PRONI pack can be used for those students who have plenty of free time now, all their assessment tasks have been completed. And we really hope that everybody looks at this thing and respects the different opinions at that time and different opinions today. And it's meant to be an educational resource for those people like myself who still love history. And finally, I thank everybody in PRONI for their support and to my good friend Tim for all his input into this thing. And I would welcome questions. Thank you.